Welcome, everybody. Good afternoon. My name is Gabe Scheinman. I'm the Executive Director of the Alexander Hamilton Society. Great to see a number of familiar names, even if it's not faces on the screen, but so many students, alumni, faculty, supporters joining us today for part of our longstanding kind of America's Role in the World book series. And today, in some ways, it's focused on maybe the most important topic or the most important challenge to the American role in the world, and that's China. And so it's really exciting to welcome our speaker, our author here today. And before I introduce him, just a couple housekeeping announcements. So first, for those of you who are interested in asking questions, I'll lead our guests in conversation, and then for the last half hour, we'll turn to questions from the audience, where I will figuratively pass you the microphone, and by that I mean I will unmute you, and you can actually ask your question verbally, like real human beings. But in order to do that, if you can submit your question in writing via the chat, via the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and then I will be able to, once looking at the questions, be able to select you. So please put your questions in, and we'll get to those towards the end. And the second is, if you like today's talk, I hope you'll join us for our next book talks. The next one is June 11th, Friday, June 11th. With Professor Neil Ferguson on his new book, Doom. And so it's a good theme here, chaos and then doom, as to what comes next, which is sort of how, in general, societies have responded to natural disasters, to external shocks. And then on June 28th, another great book called The Hardest Place, which was about an American Army unit in Afghanistan by Wesley Morgan, who's written a phenomenal long book of really work of a labor of love over many years into one of the presence of this American unit in Afghanistan, the Pesh Valley, which I think, given our supposed impending withdrawal from Afghanistan, will be particularly apt. And he'll be joined with me in conversation with the former commander of Central Command, General Joseph Votel. So I hope between chaos, doom, and The Hardest Place, we've got a very optimistic looking few weeks ahead of us. And with that, let me really welcome Josh Rogin. Josh is a columnist for the global opinions section of the Washington Post and a political analyst for CNN. Previously, he's covered foreign policy and national security for a number of publications: Bloomberg View, Newsweek, Daily Beast, and Foreign Policy Magazine. In fact, we were chatting right before. He's got framed behind him one of the first columns he's ever wrote. And so for a lot of students who are interested in going into the world of journalism, and in particular foreign policy journalism, I'm sure Josh will be eager to answer some questions about that at the end. And he's really written a wonderful book, Chaos Under Heaven: Trump, Xi, and the Battle for the 21st Century. He will have him, I don't think, like tennis players, I can have him sign the camera to get through to the book, but hopefully we can grab a drink and you'll be able to sign him afterwards. And it's really an inside look to the last 4 years of our China policy. A great book, a riveting read, a bit like watching a horse race, in my opinion, sort of who's up and who's down, and are they turning the corner, and who's in the lead and whatnot. And really based on quite a lot of interviews, including, and in addition to that, his own firsthand accounts as a reporter over the last 4 years, traveling with a number of members of the administration all over the world on some of these things. And in fact, maybe he'll share actually being an actor or player in some of these actual incidents as they've happened. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation. Like I said, I'll kind of kick us off and then open up the questions. So Josh, let me start with you and really kind of start at the beginning, which is the title of the book, right? Chaos Under Heaven. So is it chaos in the US-China relationship, chaos inside the White House? Give us a sense of, like, what is this chaos that you're talking about?
Sure. Thanks so much, Gabe. And thanks to the Alexander Hamilton Society for everything you do to bring more people into this important foreign policy conversation that we're all having. The book, the title Chaos Under Heaven, is a quote that's attributed to Mao Zedong. We couldn't actually figure out if he actually said it, but a lot of people say he said it. And the quote goes something like, "There is great chaos under heaven. The situation is excellent." At that time, Mao was pointing to the confusion and dysfunction amidst his enemies and praising that as an advantage for himself and for the Chinese Communist Party in seeking its goals and advancing its interests. And when I started reporting for the Washington Post in June, as a columnist in June 2016, I didn't know that Donald Trump was going to be elected president. But I went, as soon as the election happened, I knew that it was going to be a crazy story. And I knew that the US-China relationship would be no exception. And for sure, that's exactly what happened. And it was chaos right from the start. And I mean that during the transition. And, one of the first scandals of the Trump administration, as you remember, Gabe, was that Trump took a phone call from Tsai Ing-wen, the Taiwanese president, breaking 40 years of precedent, which was reported in the New York Times, totally wrong. And, they reported that it was like some sort of Bob Dole lobbying operation. That's not true. It was a staffer scheme to get Trump on the phone with the Taiwanese president. And when Trump realized what had happened, he was very angry, and he became very hostile to Taiwan for the first 3 years of his presidency, and that had all sorts of effects. And then that was the initial break between the Trump team and the Chinese leadership, which was then repaired in the Mar-a-Lago summit. So, in other words, it was chaos from jump, and there were different factions. The factions fought each other. They fought each other for Trump's praise and to persuade him about various policies and strategies. The factions changed over time. There was a ton of turnover. There was a lot of confusion. There was confusion that went all the way to the top. One of the chief characteristics of the Trump foreign policy was that the messaging was all broken, and diplomatic signaling went out the window. And, what I found is that Donald Trump as president actually had a very firm and consistent view of China and what he wanted to get out of his time managing the U.S.-China relationship. But he varied on the tactics, and he didn't understand the mechanics of government, and he was fighting allies at the same time, and he was pitting his factions against each other. And, that's chaos. That's a lot of chaos. And a lot of that redounded to the benefit of the Chinese Communist Party. Now, of course, they made their own mistakes and did their own misactions, and, that's part of the story too. But what I did was I reported this out in real time, and then I went back and did another 300 plus interviews with all of the players, as many as I could round up. And then, while I was doing that, of course, the coronavirus pandemic hit, and that was the ultimate chaos. That was the chaos in 7 billion people's lives, in every human's life. And, one of the narratives, one of the sort of themes of the book is this sort of idea that the U.S.-China relationship was no longer some sort of faraway issue to be dealt with by China hands and academics, that it was something that was increasingly touching the lives of Americans and really people all over the world. And that part of the U.S.-China relationship was the Chinese Communist Party's strategy to influence us, to influence our institutions, academia, and politics, and Wall Street, especially Wall Street, and the tech industry, and sports, and Hollywood, and manufacturing, and you name it. And, that in 2016, when I started reporting for this book, that was not there was not a consensus that was the case. But by 2019, that consensus was growing. And, in 2021, there's no doubt in anyone's mind that what happens in Beijing doesn't stay in Beijing. And that, if you suffered during the pandemic, to some degree, we could debate how much, the actions and policies and strategies of the Chinese Communist Party exacerbated that suffering. And that means that the problems that are inherent in a rising China that's increasingly repressive, aggressive, and interfering in free and open societies all over the world are no longer things that we can ignore, and no longer things that we can confine to the discussions of ivory tower academics and China hands. It's just not going to work. And so the book aims to sort of get the regular person, not the China hand, but the regular American or European or person in South America, Southeast Asia, to a basic level of understanding of what happened over these 4 years, the best we can know, and what that means going forward, and what are the basics of this shared problem. It doesn't mean Cold War. It doesn't mean Thucydides trap. Those are things I identify in the book as red herrings, as things that people will throw at you to dissuade us from having an honest conversation about the real problems of the CCP's actions as China rises, right? So we can get into all that, but the bottom line is that the chaos was baked into the DNA of the Trump administration. It doesn't mean they did everything wrong. Quite the contrary. There was a lot good. There was a lot bad. There was a lot that was ugly. And we are where we are. And now we have this shared problem. We need to have a national, probably an international, definitely international conversation about our shared solutions.
So let's dive into that. So let's start kind of towards the beginning. So you broke down the protagonists in this story inside the Trump administration into different groups and how they were at odds with each other, and who was up and who was down, and who cornered whom and who survived. And these groups in many ways represent, to your, as you talk about the book, different mindsets about things. So give us the Mean Girls cafeteria tour, let's call it, into these different groups, and to help us understand where these debates lied.
So at the first table, you have the Superhawks. Okay. This is lot of campaign people, including Steve Bannon, Peter Navarro, NSC official Robert Spalding, Steve Miller to some extent. These were people who wanted to bring down the CCP, who believed that the Chinese Communist Party, as a nationalist, socialist, totalitarian, increasingly fascist, increasingly criminal organization, must be stopped at all costs. And that if we are looking at it clear-eyed, then the only sane thing to do is to do whatever we can to undermine and contain and bring them down from the inside as much as we can. That's what they think. I don't think that, okay, just full disclosure, but that's the Superhawks. And, if you listen to the campaign, you might think that that's exactly what Donald Trump would have done, because they were writing the speeches during the campaign. They were laying the groundwork for the trade war. And, what actually happened is that as soon as the Trump team got into office, they lost power. And Trump handed over the reins again, because he was pissed off about being tricked into taking a phone call from the Taiwanese president. He handed over the reins to Jared Kushner, who promptly handed it over to Steve Mnuchin and Wilbur Ross and Rex Tillerson. And, the Mnuchin sort of Gary Cohn wing is what I call the Wall Street clique, right? These were, bankers, financial guys, Wall Street guys, okay, real estate guys, New York guys, mostly Democrats, actually. They thought the national security hawks were problematically interjecting irritants into the relationship that were going to hurt business. They wanted to make a deal. They thought that's what Trump wanted. And to some extent, they were right, which is to make a deal, an early deal with the Chinese on trade that would fix imbalances, but also be something that the president could run on and get back to business and open up Chinese markets and shove all that human rights and national security stuff to the side. And they had the control of the policy for the first few months, and they set upon trying to make a quick trade deal with Beijing. It didn't work for a number of reasons that you'll have to read the book to learn about. All right. And then meanwhile, there was another group. So then you had that, what I call the axis of adults. And these are like the old Washington sacred cows who thought they were the guardians of the republic, who fashioned themselves as some sort of guardrails to keep the crazy president from driving the car off the road. We're talking about Jim Mattis, John Kelly, H.R. McMaster. These were guys who are steeped in Washington, right? And they were, hardliners when it comes to the national security side, but not for trade nationalism. They're, most, traditional Washington guys are free traders at heart, so they were skeptical of the Superhawks' efforts to start a trade war, and they certainly didn't want to bring down the CCP. Eventually, all of them got cycled out because, Trump, they would either, tell Trump stuff he didn't like, or they, get shoved out by some of the other factions, etc. Then there were the hardliners, and the hardliners are people like John Bolton, Matt Pottinger, Robert O'Brien, Mike Pompeo, Mike Pence, to a large degree, and they were somewhere in the middle, right? Closer to the Hawks, but not so intent on driving this relationship towards confrontation, which is obviously a risk that it drives towards conflict. But the hardliners wanted to do is they wanted to reset the relationship, not blow it up for the fun of it, but in a fundamental way. And they wanted to inject national security concerns into other parts of the U.S.-China interaction, including in industry and in tech and in Wall Street and all the rest. But this team really didn't have the power, the political ball at any real time until the very end, until the coronavirus hit. And so they worked more largely behind the scenes, and they worked inside the government, and they were allied with a lot of people in law enforcement and the intelligence community who had been wanting to take a more competitive and more confrontational response towards China's misactions and bad behaviors for a long time, and finally had somebody near the top of the administration who agreed with them. Then you had the bureaucrats who didn't like the Trump people at all, and maintained the status quo, wanted to maintain the status quo. And each of these groups had champions over time, and sometimes they succeeded, and sometimes they failed, and sometimes they canceled each other out. But in the end, what happened was, to make a long story a little bit shorter, is that the hardliners won out. But not because they played better Machiavellian games or because they had the best policy documents, not because the national defense strategy was just so exquisitely crafted that it won the day. It was because the Chinese Communist Party proved them right. In other words, their bet was that no matter what the Wall Street clique offered Beijing, that the Chinese leadership was never going to really change its economic and industrial policies in a way that was going to make any bit of difference whatsoever. And so they worked inside the system to steer the policy to succeed if and when that became an eventuality. In other words, the political people were doing the trade talks, but the technical people did the tariffs. And the tariffs were designed, just for one example, to exert ongoing pain into the Chinese economy. And so they weren't designed for a deal. They were designed to prepare if there was no deal. And of course, there was a deal, but it was a phase one deal. It was very minimal. It didn't really achieve any of the structural changes. And then the deal was overtaken 2 days later by the coronavirus, which blew up the relationship, and it went downhill from there.
So are these there? No, I mean, and we'll get into that. So are these kind of, you talked about 4 or 5 groups, right? Super hawks, hardliners, Wall Street, axis of adults, bureaucrats, et cetera. Are these, in your mind, like the 4 or 5 faces of Trump, in the sense that, he could look at these and say, yeah, I agree with that, and I agree with that, and I agree with that? Or are they kind of, more outright conflicting to each other in that way?
Right. It's a good question. I think what's really interesting is that, no one ever, so all of these groups had their moments, and there were major speeches. I remember when Pence made a big China speech, Pompeo had some speeches, Christopher Wray had some speeches, everybody gave a speech on what the administration's China policy was. And every time I would hear one of those, anytime anyone would hear one of those, you would think, oh, okay, I guess that's what it is. But the truth is that they were all projecting their own China policies, and that we never really got a speech on China from the president of the United States. He never laid out for the American people what his theory of the case. It never happened.
So let me ask about that specifically, just to drill down on that, which is like, so you said, right, as you detail in the book, right, the president had longstanding views on China, right? And you talk about in the book how you as part of your work, you went back and read everything the man has written that comes even to talking about the subject, right? So kind of first question on that point, which is, were you actually able to interview the president for the book? No. So I'm curious to hear that. And then the second question is, if he read the book, right, would he look at it and be like, yep, Rogin, you got it right? Or like, Rogin, you're crazy, you got it wrong? Or was it like, I'm actually learning things about my own people, my administration, that I didn't even necessarily realize were going on?
Right. Good questions. So for your first question, it's true that Trump had a very firm view of the U.S.-China relationship. He cared about getting a trade deal. He didn't care about the human rights. He didn't really care about the national security stuff either, except as far as it could be used as a wedge, as leverage to get the trade deal. But he didn't know anything about the tactics. And that's what created the confusion, is he changed his mind about the tactics all the time. And, essentially what he did was, at the end of 2019, at the very beginning of 2020, is that he settled, he compromised, he struck a bad trade deal because he thought it was in his political interest. Little did he know that the coronavirus pandemic was coming, and that would actually tank his re-election bid. And then he blamed that on China. He went super anti-China and started saying racist stuff and all of that. So he actually came full circle. He started in the campaign bashing China for political reasons. Then he reached out to try to make a friendship and then try to make a deal. Then it went back and forth, and he actually made the deal, and then he went back to bashing, and because it was in his political interest. Now, the problem for all the people underneath him was they didn't necessarily know that. They had to all sort of compete to understand that, and then to influence that, or sometimes to trick him, sometimes to fight each other. And it was really complicated. And, so I interviewed, amongst other people, Vice President Pence, Pompeo, O'Brien, Mark Esper, Pottinger, Bannon, Navarro. I have talked to Jared several times, everyone except Trump, basically. I've got to everyone except Trump. And, that was just because I was writing the book in the middle of the pandemic while he's running for re-election, and it just couldn't be, I guess he had got burned on the Bob Woodward book too. And the thing about the Bob Woodward book was, like, so he talked to Bob Woodward 18 times, but, if you listen to those tapes, and all credit to Bob Woodward for getting him on the record 18 times, they all contradict each other. And he contradicts himself sometimes in the same sentence. And part of writing about Trump is understanding that he's constantly contradicting himself, and he's denying things for no good reason that are obviously true, and then he's confirming things for no good reason that are not necessarily true. And so it's impossible to understand, at least for me, but I think honestly for anyone, what he would say about this or that or the other. It seems to me that he would make a calculation in his head. Is it good for me to confirm this, rather than, is this true? And so I don't know what he would say, but as far as I can tell from all the other people that I talked to, they think that I put together more of the pieces of the U.S.-China relationship in the Trump administration than anyone else has. That doesn't mean it's perfect. It's a second draft of history, let's say, but I got more pieces, more reporting, more interviews, more perspectives, more details than had previously been published. That's the best I can say about it.
So you talk about in the book how the election of President Trump in 2016 was an earthquake to U.S.-China policy. That's certainly things were changing a little bit towards the end of the Obama administration. I think you have this anecdote in the book, for example, that then National Security Advisor Susan Rice forbade the Pentagon from not only using the term China, but even kind of using the term great power competition. And obviously, given the way the national security strategy, or at least the public-facing one, was released, 180-degree turn on some of those things. I'm wondering if you could kind of play out for us, and they're counterfactuals, of course, which is how would a Hillary Clinton administration, you think, tackle this problem, which is kind of one bucket, and then the other, which is how would given that obviously a surprise to most of the Republican electorate, at least the Republican elites on that end, how would a different Republican administration, you think, in 2016, whether that was a Marco Rubio or a Ted Cruz or a Scott Walker, what have you, administration, what do you think what the main differences would have been looking back on?
I got you. The prologue of the book runs through this fairly briskly, but basically the argument that I make is that, since we granted China PNTR status and it allowed it to join the WTO at the very top of the century, there's been this ongoing and growing and raging debate, mostly inside the China watching community, but now spilling out into the rest of society about, have we lost this essential bet? And I'm simplifying it to be sure, but the bet being that if we engage China as much as possible, integrate them as much as possible, that they could be convinced to liberalize economically, which would in turn lead them to liberalize politically, which would in turn solve the rest of our problems. We'd live together in peace and happiness and avoid the Cold War and the Thucydides trap or whatever other straw man you want to point to. All right. So I think that, again, I'm simplifying it, but that's the basic bet. Now, I talked to people like Joseph Nye for the book, and he told me, I remember, this isn't in the book, but he said, we had a hedge, right? Our system of alliances and the hub and spoke in Japan and developing all of our, institutions and relationships, blah, 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 that was the hedge in case the bet failed. Okay. Well, okay. I get that's what they thought was the hedge. Doesn't seem to have been enough, but that's a separate issue. But anyway, when you get to the beginning of the Obama administration, it was already clear to many people, especially even inside the Obama administration, that bet didn't seem to be paying off. Okay. And the Hillary Clinton State Department in the first term was actually pushing for a more hawkish, more competitive approach. Remember the pivot to Asia? Kurt Campbell wrote that. It was in Foreign Policy Magazine, where I worked at the time. I remember that very clearly. You had another side, right? There was the Jim Steinberg side, which was like, he had this like strategic reassurance idea, which didn't fly, but that was his counter to that. And he and people like Jeff Bader were much more willing to take more time to see if this bet could pay off. And they didn't see it as gravely as people like Kurt Campbell and Hillary Clinton. Anyway, Clinton left, Kerry came in, and what he did was he sort of joined the optimist camp, and because he had different priorities. Same thing with Susan Rice. Now, that's not to say that Susan Rice and John Kerry believed the thing in 2021 that they believed in 2013. I'm not saying that. Like, people have the right to evolve. I'm sure their views have evolved. In fact, Susan Rice wrote a whole piece about how now she's like very competitive against China, whatever. But at that time, they were pushing for more cooperation and more engagement and less competition and less confrontation, because they had other priorities, because they needed the Chinese government to help them on all their other stuff like the Iran deal and climate change, et cetera. Now, once Xi Jinping came to power, right, that it started to become even more clear that he was taking China in a different direction, but not right away. And in 2014 and 2015, you saw him and President Obama really make this effort. And keep in mind that the number one Xi Jinping interlocutor at the time was a guy named Vice President Joe Biden, who had 25 hours of dinner. So, what had happened was that the Obama team and Ben Rhodes and Susan Rice decided to really take one last chance on this guy, Xi Jinping. And they signed the cyber agreement. Oh, wow, that's great. We're not going to do cyber hacking anymore. He said so. He signed the agreement, and then, they got together. Oh, we're not going to, at Sunnylands, we're going to become friends. And, we're not going to militarize the South China Sea. And, Xi Jinping stood there next to Obama. He's like, yeah, we have no intention of, he didn't say we won't do it. He said, we have no intention of militarizing the South China Sea, right? So he's just totally lying, right? But at that time, even there were some well-meaning people like Susan Rice and Ben Rhodes who were like, we got to take a chance on these guys. And by 2016, it seemed clear to a lot of people that this was a fool's bet and that the gambit had failed. But, it was really hard for people like Kerry and Rice to relinquish that. And in fact, 1 week before the 2016 election, they met with Yang Jiechi in New York, and it was like a handover meeting. And like, don't worry, Hillary Clinton's going to come in. We're going to have a lot of continuity. It's going to be wonderful. Now, I think what we're seeing now with Kurt Campbell and Joe Biden and Jake Sullivan, another Clinton person, is what we would have seen in 2017 if Hillary had won. In other words, it's not Trump, but it's not Obama. It's somewhere in the middle. It's like a Trump light, like a nicer, friendlier competition strategy. It's more multilateral. They don't really like the tariffs, so they haven't gotten rid of the tariffs. They don't like sanctioning allies, that kind of thing. So I think sort of in a way, Jake and Kurt are picking up where they left off. Now that's fine, but I think the problem with that is that they're failing to understand a lot of the ways that things have changed in the 4 years because they weren't there, and they didn't know exactly how we got to various points in the Commerce Department and in our Wall Street delisting efforts and all this kind of detailed stuff that they just didn't witness. I think if Marco Rubio or Jeb Bush had been elected president, we would have seen something in between that, like not as closer to Trump, but not so trade nationalistic. Although if you look at what Marco Rubio says these days, it's more trade nationalistic than it used to be.
I mean, it sounds like what you're saying, and obviously, the adversary gets a vote, and it sounds like what you're saying, that no matter what, it wouldn't have been a just kind of slow or gradual continuation over where we were in 2016, that regardless of whether it had been the Hillary team or a different Republican, there was a shift.
I'm saying that the Chinese Communist Party's strategy and behavior has become so egregious and so wanton that it's really impossible for any honest and halfway competent administration to ignore it. We didn't have concentration camps, right? We had abuses in Xinjiang, horrible abuses that the international community turned a blind eye to, the same way they did in Tibet and various other places. But concentration camps, that's different, right? That's different. And those didn't exist in 2013. They existed in 2017, right? And Trump told Xi Jinping that was the perfectly right thing to do, according to John Bolton's book. That's terrible. But at the same time, then the State Department raised the issue. So that was part of the chaos. So it's not as if, the Biden administration can come in and pick up exactly where Obama left off, because there were certain things that were undeniable, but there's a lot of nuance that's lost. And to be clear, I think the part of the Trump administration policies that have remained, represent a lot of leverage. Okay. It doesn't matter if you don't like how we got there, if you don't like the tactics that they used, if you didn't like the justifications for all these tariffs and sanctions, regardless, they represent a lot of leverage. And I think there's a fight inside the Biden administration, right? I know there's a fight inside the Biden administration right now over whether or not to use that leverage or to let it go. If you look at some of their actions, it seems like they see that, it would be kind of, this is my opinion, it'd be kind of foolish to just get rid of all the sanctions and tariffs, even if you don't like them, without asking for some behavior change in return. Because again, the tariffs and the sanctions are not, if they don't change the Chinese behavior, what they do is they impose an ongoing cost for that bad behavior. And over time, that can have its own effects. So I think that's what you're going to see next, is the fight inside the Biden administration between, do we just let all this leverage go, or do we try to use it to achieve some sort of behavior change on the Chinese side, if that's even possible? And if that behavior change won't come, do we just keep it because it, again, increases the cost for their bad behavior and also advances our interests in other ways?
So just a reminder to the audience, if you want to submit questions, please do so in the Q&A function, and we'll get to them later. So if you described the election of President Trump as kind of an earthquake to U.S.-China policy, clearly the COVID-19 pandemic was the even bigger earthquake in many ways on a variety of fronts. And if there's one thing that certainly has changed fundamentally since 2016, regardless of the new team, they have to reckon with that, right? And you've written about this and followed this up closely. Even now, 18 months after the first indication of some sort of deadly virus, we still don't know. And the Chinese government has lied and stonewalled what the origin of it is. So post-COVID, how in your mind did the administration absorb, let's call it the China element of COVID, right? Obviously, there's the all-consuming element of it in the United States, a public health crisis, an economic crisis, and so forth. But how in your mind did these different teams, these different factions absorb, how to see China, or do they see China differently as a consequence of COVID?
Right. It depends on who you talk to. So, what the book details, and again, I didn't know this when I started writing the book because there was no pandemic, but what it details is what happened in U.S.-China relations inside those relations as the pandemic got worse and worse. And, one of the things that happened is that Xi Jinping lied to President Trump. He said it was under control in 2 separate phone calls, reported exclusively in Chaos Under Heaven, chapter 14. He lied. He said that they've got it under control, that it would go away in warm weather, that herbal medicine could be used to treat it, several other lies, which fed into the garble in the President Trump's head, which resulted in a garble, exacerbated the garble of his administration's policies, and fed a lot of terrible, doesn't excuse Trump's response, but it fed a lot of trends inside the Trump administration that were gearing towards a lot of policies that made a lot of Americans sick and died. So that was one thing. The other thing is that they blackmailed the State Department to shut up about the origin of the coronavirus, and they held our masks and our PPE over our head at our time of need. Not just us, countries all over the world. They used their first mover advantage, being the first country that had the virus, and the country with all the masks and everything. There were our masks, but they weren't really our masks. And because they nationalized our factories in the middle of the crisis, and then blackmailed us with our masks and said, if you want your masks, if you want your PPE, then you'll shut up about the origin of the coronavirus. And then, I threw a wrench into that a little bit by in April 2020, disclosing that there were these diplomatic cables that pointed back to concerns about these labs in Wuhan, which had been doing risky back coronavirus research and had lacked safety standards, et cetera. We could talk about that if you want. But anyway, then the coronavirus origin story became super politicized for a lot of crazy reasons that I think most viewers by this week are learning about again, as the media struggles to sort of, how did this all get political? Read my book. You'll figure out how it got politicized. If you want to know how the coronavirus pandemic origin story got all screwed up, just read the book. It's all in there. And, so now the Biden team is like sort of left with this mess, and they don't really know what to do. And I think the struggle, again, is in a similar way to the last administration, is between the national security people who see the geopolitical and geostrategic angles of this pandemic as things that need to be monitored and managed, and hopefully actually conducted with some sort of strategery whatsoever. I'm in that camp. I think it's just obvious that geopolitics and the pandemic are intertwined. That's how the Chinese see it. That's why they've been playing games with PPE, using vaccines to bribe and coerce and threaten countries all over the world, right? So, but a lot of other people in the administration don't see it that way. The public health people and the coronavirus lead people, they think, oh no, we're in a world pandemic. We just have to do what's best for the world, and it doesn't matter about, we don't play games. I remember when I went to the State Department, it was like, the Chinese government is threatening Latin American countries, or blackmailing, or whatever word you want to use. They're saying to them, if you dump Taiwan, you get your shots. If you don't want the shots, then keep diplomatic recognition of Taiwan. In other words, they're using their power to save lives to advance their political interests in our backyard. And for weeks, I was asking everybody in the administration, like, what are we doing about this? The answer was we weren't doing anything about it, because the Biden administration had made a decision that we don't play geopolitics with shots. Okay, well, then guess what? The rest of the world, that's actually happening. So maybe we should pay attention to it. We saw that last week. I wrote about this again. The South Koreans come to town. Now, I get it that South Korea is a first world country, and compared to India or something, the rate of cases is relatively low. But the one thing they wanted was some shots, right? They're like, it would help Moon politically. They're facing a surge. They're getting pressure from China too. They don't want the Chinese shots. The shots are no good. And for like a week, I was like, are we going to give them any shots or what? And finally, they were like, they created some sort of half measure where they gave them shots for the Korean soldiers who interact with the American soldiers. In other words, we'll give you shots only if we can justify it in our self-interest. Well, which is it? Is it America first, or is it America's back? You know what I mean? Are we leading on this thing, or are we just concerned about our own tushies? And, right now it seems to be the latter. And that's been consistent in every stage of this crisis, right? Because it's not the first, it was the PPE, then it was the vaccines, but there's going to be several more stages: reconstruction, supply chains, broad economic devastation, rebuilding, like a total revamping of public health. What are we going to do with all this virus research? $200 million of risky virus research. Is that a good idea? Like, all of these things, they're just not on the ball with, frankly. It's kind of shocking, again, because they're like, drinking from the fire hose, and they're like, oh, there's only a few people in, how the Obama Obama administration was like, the power was concentrated in the White House and the NSC. Like one of the Trump things was that they actually let the agencies, they delegated to the agencies. It didn't always go well, but they did that. And they shrunk the NSC. Well, now the Biden people, I say Obama, it's the same people. The Obama Biden people, it's the exact same people, expanded the NSC and concentrated power back in the White House. Okay, well, I get why they do that. It's less leaking. It makes sense politically, but they can't do everything with a limited number of people. And they're always, putting out fires, and like, they're not thinking over the horizon, or if they are, it's that thinking is not making it into the policy that I can see. So I just think that, it's really kind of overdue. And, I think the coronavirus origin investigation is a big part of that. That's what I'm about to write about today. If you're listening to this, watch this space. There'll be an article in the Washington Post later today about how the Biden administration is not doing enough to investigate like, how do we have can you imagine after 9/11, or, that everyone's like, oh, well, how did that happen? Oh, well, listen, we don't want to, let's not look into it. Or, oh, what happened in 9/11? Oh, we'll let the UN take care of that. It would never, you wouldn't think that way. But for some reason in our current politics and in our current discourse, this is idea like, oh, well, we can never figure out what happened in the pandemic. I just like cross our fingers and hope it doesn't happen again, which is crazy, which is really irresponsible. And, I get why people say that. I get the politics of it. Again, I wrote a book about it, but it doesn't excuse it. So I think that, in a sense, we have a much more competent administration, but it doesn't mean that they're doing all the right things or taking this as seriously as they should.
So looking back on the last year and a half of COVID, are you at all surprised? We can debate whether it's the Cold War is the right term or not, but put that aside. Are you surprised that actually the relationship hasn't gone hot? I mean, the way your book goes, it's crisis after crisis, right? Taiwan, Hong Kong, the NBA, and then later on, obviously, the determination by now 2 administrations of ongoing genocide in Xinjiang, right? I mean, each of these alone potentially could have caused something to go over the edge, and then COVID. So looking back on it, are you surprised that maybe actually there weren't actually some actual kinetic action, or is there actually a broader, kind of stability or structural forces that allow this competition to go quite energetic, but stay under a certain level?
It's a good question. No, I'm not surprised, because I never, my argument the whole time, and the argument I make in the book, is that the U.S.-China strategic competition is not a military competition foremost. It's actually an economic, technological, and ideological competition foremost. In other words, it's in neither side's interest to have any sort of kinetic conflict. Chinese don't want it. We don't want it. And that would be certainly a huge failure of the policy on both sides. Nevertheless, the confrontation and the struggle is real, and it's ongoing. So what does that tell you? It tells you it's not really about the ships passing through the freedom of that's the things that we're always fighting the last war. Like really, is it really about the ships passing through the freedom of? No, it's not. It's about a broad economic, ideological, and technological expansion that affects our lives and the lives of people in free and open societies and in the developing world in a real way, and often in a malign way. And that's the struggle that we're in. And that's why the Thucydides trap analogy is so faulty, in my view, is because, well, for 2 reasons. One, because I think that the Graham Allison's book cherry picked its examples. You could find 16 examples and then 12 examples out of 16 say this, you know what I mean? But you could pick any 16 and any 12. But putting that aside, I think it's kind of wrong to say that like the thing that causes kinetic conflict is risingness and fallingness. That's one reason countries go to war. There could be any number of reasons. Risingness and fallingness and upwardness and downwardness. It's just one aspect. By the way, it's totally impossible to measure, especially over the large sweep of history, who's up and who's down. It's just a way of sort of that. I think it's been used. I don't think this is the intent. It's been used as a way to sort of dissuade us from confronting Chinese Communist Party bad behavior on a range of fronts, on a range of arenas. And same thing with the Cold War. Like you kind of said it in your question, which is like, wait a second, why hasn't there been a hot war? Well, as it turns out, the Cold War is not the worst outcome. It's not a good outcome. The best outcome is we live together in peace and harmony, and they stop doing the genocides, and we don't have no reason to sanction them, right? That would be great. That's my best outcome, is they no more genocides, no more trade abuses. Then we don't have to protect ourselves and stand up for human dignity.
Seems like a low bar. Seems like a low
that
bar.
would be the best. I'm just saying, if they wanted, that's how we could solve this right now, is the Chinese Communist Party lets all the Uyghurs out and stops doing all of its malign stuff that's pointed at us, right? And that's not to say that we're 100% innocent, but you get what I mean. Barring that, we're headed towards some sort of limited, not total, limited decoupling, where we have to protect ourselves. Like, and like nobody would have thought in 2018 that we would need mask factories. Why would you put mask factory in the United? It doesn't make any sense, right? It's cheaper to do in China. Well, now everybody understands. I guess we're going to need our own masks, right? Oh, maybe we shouldn't have Chinese tech in our 5G telecom. Oh, well, okay. Well, that's a big thing. It has nothing to do with kinetic war. So no, I don't think I think that kinetic war, again, is something of a red herring. I think it's part of sort of like, it's like what Kissinger was, we're headed towards, we can't confront China because then we're going to head towards conflict. No. I think actually my view is that the more that we let these problems fester, the more dangerous it becomes. In other words, with the Chinese Communist Party, their appetite grows with the eating, and the more powerful they get, the more they tell us to go screw. Okay, and they stop caring about what we say or do about it. And so there's other worse outcomes besides a Cold War, right? One is that we have a hot war. One is that rather than us shaping China, they begin to shape us. This is the interference piece of the book, where they become so powerful and so ingrained in our institutions that we don't have the ability to have the international rules of the road that protect us, that protect our prosperity and our national security and our public health. And if you just think about it, like all the people are like, oh, well, how can you attack scientific collaboration with China? Well, how can we accept scientific collaboration with China if they, shut it down in the crisis and won't tell us what the hell is going on inside these labs? Whether or not the labs did it, we don't know, but I'm just saying it seems pretty clear we're going to have to take a look at that collaboration, because when the chips are down, there is no collaboration. They've abused it to the point that Americans are dying. Hundreds of thousands of Americans are dying. So if you can't cooperate on a pandemic, what can you cooperate on? It means we need to rethink everything, and we need to realize that engagement is good, but only when it's not weaponized against us. And that seems to be, a good place to start.
So last question for me, and then I want to turn it over to questions for the audience. So what would a second term Trump China policy have looked like? I don't know if that's your current book is the nonfiction volume, and the other one is the fiction volume. I don't know how to think about it, but clearly the camps you're talking about would not have necessarily been the same in the moment that we're in. So what would that have looked like?
So it would have been. I think you would have gone full Super Hawk, because a lot of the first 3 years was like, Trump really having a lot of faith in his relationship with his good friend Xi Jinping. I'm not a pro-Trump guy. I'm not an anti-Trump guy. If you read my book, you'll see there's some praise of him and there's some criticism of him, but it's kind of hard not to be honest about the fact that he got took by Xi Jinping, who, told him all these lies that affected our policy in really horrendous ways. And eventually he realized it, but he realized they weren't friends, and turned on his good friend Xi Jinping, and he unleashed his national security people. And had he won, running again for the second time, but this time with no chance of a trade deal and with the coronavirus pandemic raging and Trump needing someone to blame. Because again, we have to be honest. He abused the issue. He conflated racism and the coronavirus pandemic in a cruel way. That came at a time when we had a rise of anti-Asian hate and violence in our country, which is a stain on our country and a stain on our society. And it also merged the ideas of anti-Asian hate and confronting the CCP in a way that we really need to undo. In other words, they're two separate things. We have to fight hate and confront the CCP on its bad actions. At the same time, there are a lot of people who believe that, but in part because of what Trump did. Now, that's a long way of saying if he had gotten reelected, we would have gone over the hill with that stuff. Okay, it was getting super politicized China policy, a lot of really harsh China actions, a lot of which were probably needed and overdue, but not with forget about the Wall Street clique, it would have been all super hawks and hardliners. And that would have been pretty crazy. One of the things the hardliners came to believe, people like Pottinger came to believe, is that the more that the United States and like-minded countries sort of woke up to what the CCP strategy was and talked honestly about their malign actions, especially inside of our societies, that the Chinese government actually sped up its plans. That, rather than respond, in other words, if our goal was to make them behave better, that didn't work. They're behaving worse. right? Everything that has gone on in U.S. foreign policy, a huge change. Again, I'm for the change. I'm an opinion columnist. I can tell you what I really think. We needed a new strategic approach. The Trump administration launched an imperfect and incomplete attempt at that. That's the Biden administration's charge, in my view, is to fix that and advance it, not to go backwards, but to move forwards with a new competitive approach. But mistakes were made. And if you think about a second Trump administration, I think what you would have seen, and the question is whether or not the CCP can even change course, because maybe Xi Jinping has become so powerful and purged so many of his enemies that he's destroyed the dissent mechanism inside of his own system. I think it's somewhat unknowable, but I think we have to keep that in the back of our minds, which has an implication. It means the more we escalate, the more that they escalate. That's the escalation ladder. That's that people like Henry Kissinger are always drawing about, you know? So I think that would have been a greater risk, not to say that we know exactly what they would have done. I think we just would have seen hawks and hardliners all day long, and that would have been pretty crazy. But anyway, well, that didn't happen. Yeah.
It may happen in the future, although obviously there'll be intervening years. So maybe the story will turn again, but it means you got 4 years of respite before having to write the second volume, let's say. So let's go to questions. So I will, when I call your name, I will figuratively pass you the mic, which in Zoom terms means unmute you. And if you could just introduce yourself and your affiliation, and then pose your question directly to Josh. So first question goes to Lisa Curtis, who I think probably knows a little bit of something on this topic. So Lisa, up to you.
Thank you for your service, Lisa.
Thank you. And thanks so much for hosting this. And congratulations, Josh. I'm sure it's a great book. I haven't had a chance to read it yet, but I'm really looking forward to it. So great work. So Lisa Curtis, I'm the program director for Indo-Pacific Security at the Center for New American Security. Spent the last 3.5 years working in the Trump administration as the senior director for South and Central Asia. So my question, Josh, I'm sure you've seen the Indo-Pacific Strategic Framework, which the president signed in February 2018 and was released to the American public shortly before the Trump administration ended in January. So my question to you is, because from my perspective, that drove our China strategy sort of across the board, across the government, up until probably the coronavirus. And then, as you mentioned, things were chaos. So despite the fact that President Trump had some peculiarities in his approach, fairly chaotic approach to things, do you think that the strategic framework demonstrates that, in fact, there was a sort of overarching strategy that most arms of the U.S. government were following, at least until the outbreak of the coronavirus? Because I think that would say something about sort of the larger foreign policy of the Trump administration. And, people like me, I'm sure there were others who were on a daily basis just doing their best to try to have the best policies possible based on our expertise, and just, continuing to pursue that despite, having a fairly unpredictable president.
Yeah, thank you so much, Lisa. And again, thank you for your service. It's a great question because, I think there were, and I do get into this in the book, and I do actually talk about that strategic framework, and I tell an inside story about it, which I'll briefly run over in my answer to you right now, which is that, there were the two narratives. One was like, oh, look at these documents. This is the real policy, and don't worry about what you see on Fox News. And then there was another school of thought was like, oh, no, none of that matters, because only what matters is what Trump thinks. And all he does is talk to Lou Dobbs and Sean Hannity and Tucker Carlson. So we should just focus on that and forget the documents. They're a waste of time. And what I determined, what my judgment from my reporting is that both of those were incorrect, and that the truth actually lies somewhere in the middle. And, you say most of the agencies, what my experience, and again, just doing my own interviews and touching as many parts of the machine as possible, was that in the end, those documents had much more of an effect down the downrange. In other words, inside the system, inside each of these bureaucracies, especially in the intelligence community and in the law enforcement, in DOJ, even in commerce, where they were having all of these battles. Okay. And you had China hawks who had been sitting in all these agencies for like 20 years, who were like, never won the day, and never got their policy. But now they had this to point to, look, we've got this is our policy. And they ended up winning a lot more battles. And I think a lot of that was part of it intentionally, right? That's what Pottinger always used to say, is that he was fighting the Chinese and fighting the bureaucracy at the same time. And so I think those documents had a very important effect on what was going on inside the government that didn't get covered at the time, that I endeavored to cover in my book. I think that's the point you're getting to, and I agree with that. On the other hand, at the points where those documents interacted with Trump and his friends and his whims, the documents lost. Okay, and because there was no pattern to that, sometimes the documents won, sometimes they didn't. Tracing all of that was very difficult, very complicated. I endeavored to do that as best I could, but one funny thing that's in the book is that, and it's not just the Indo-Pacific strategy, it was the national security strategy and the 2 classified reviews that at the very beginning of the administration that I'm sure you're aware of, that I talk about in the book, which are the Chinese economic aggression and one on Chinese influence efforts. These were very important in a sense. And they built over time a body of work that stands, that actually, if you read the Biden administration national security strategy, it clearly builds off that. There's a lot of continuity there. So those were worthy efforts. But one thing is that when I would travel around the world, I went with Pence. I remember being in Shangri-La in Singapore, and Mattis was there, and he was rolling out the defense part of it. And I interviewed Phil Davidson, who was the PACOM commander. They're very proud of this document, but like, if you just talk to the other countries, they're like, oh no, wait, this is not what I see on my TV. You know what I mean? And then so there was a huge disconnect, which I think undermined them. And then when they actually came out with that strategy, finally they took all and they put it out in January 2020. That night, and Dr. Pillsbury and Lou Dobbs and KT McFarland railed against it on Fox News. Lou Dobbs did a whole show bashing it, right? And and insensate. I forget what the quote was. Like, he called everybody names. KT McFarland was like, I know the NSC. The NSC would never come up with such a weak Biden-like a document. And Pillsbury was like, yeah, if Trump never saw this, they're trying to tear down the strategy on the day it's released on Lou Dobbs. Why are they doing that? They're doing that because they're, again, trying to reach Trump, because he never misses the show. And so they have their own interests. So I think that's the fairest way that I can say that all of that work did matter and was undercover at the time, but it doesn't erase the chaos, and it doesn't undo the things that Trump himself and some of his buddies did.
Next question. Let's go to Noah Burke. Noah, the microphone is yours. Go ahead, Noah.
Hi, thank you so much for coming. I was able to attend an event you went to at American University on the Uyghur events. Definitely enjoyed that. I had a question. More recently, some members of Congress are calling for the U.S. to do a 1980 style boycott of the upcoming Olympics. Is it worthwhile to do these sort of diplomatic, you could say, attacks against the PRC, or is that not really effective in the long term?
Depends what you mean by effective. I mean, right now, as you're alluding to, in Washington, there's this tortured debate over what are we going to do about the Olympics, right? Inside the administration, it's a super tortured debate with various views. Inside Congress, it's very tortured. And I'm sorry, that's a bad pun, because the Uyghurs are getting tortured. That was unintentional. But the bottom line is that Nancy Pelosi came out and she said, okay, well, we'll have a diplomatic boycott. The athletes can go, but we shouldn't have any heads of state there. And then Ted Cruz came out and Mitt Romney, independently of each other, by the way, not talking to diplomatic boycotts don't work. We should just go to the games. We'll find other ways to object to the genocide. And, I can give you my personal view, which is that, this is the key moment of perhaps one of the last moments of leverage that we have against the Chinese Communist Party, something that they care about. It's about their legitimacy, right? The 2008 Olympics was about their legitimacy. And we had similar hand wringing at the time, where people like Henry Kissinger was like, don't criticize China during the Olympics, just let them have their moment in the sun, right? And then you had other people who were like, no, this is the only time they care about what we think. This is the only time they even are going to pause for a second to think, what is our image like, that we're not, spinning on in our propaganda. And those two things canceled each other out. I remember George W. Bush very clearly. There's a famous story. He called Hu Jintao. He said, okay, good news, bad news. I'm coming to the Olympics. That's the good news. The bad news is I'm going to host the Dalai Lama, right? He was that seemed balanced. You could call it splitting the baby, but it was at least balanced. But that was 2008. We're in 2021, okay? And it's not, and there's a genocide going on. And my argument is that that's different, okay? And my argument is that that's an order of magnitude more horrendous, and that these types of systematic crimes against humanity warrant an even, a more forceful response than the legitimate and grievances of the Tibetans in 2008. And that, if we if we don't realize that this is perhaps one of the final opportunities to convince the Chinese Communist Party that what the free world thinks about it matters to them, then after that it's going to be really, really ugly. Because then what are we going to do? I'm not worried about the Olympics. I'm worried about the day after the Olympics, when everyone goes, did you see all the piano players? They were all in unison. What a great games. Kumbaya. Aren't we all one shared humanity? Don't worry about those Uyghurs. We'll get to that later. But then what's the leverage? Then after that, I think, and I think this concern is shared by a lot of people in the know that I trust, that's when the PRC is really going to turn towards some really aggressive stuff, Taiwan and Hong Kong and God knows what else. And you have to realize that the trends are all going in that direction, that the internal repression, the external aggression, the interference of free and open societies, and the attitude of, how dare you tell us not to commit a genocide, and there's no genocide, but don't tell us not to commit it. That all of those stuff is getting worse. And so to me, it seems like we have to do more. Now, you can debate what tactics, is this more, is that more? And, personally, I don't think I could sit in that stadium and or run on that field, knowing that I'm in a country where genocide against Muslims is ongoing. That personally makes me sick to my stomach. And if that doesn't make you sick to your stomach, okay, well, then just think of the strategy of it. And if that doesn't convince you, well, then I guess, have fun at the games.
All right, next, let's go to Roy Eakin. And Roy, just remember to introduce yourself.
Hello, thank you for being here. Okay. I really enjoyed the book.
Sorry, can I say one more thing, Roy, before I get to you?
Oh, of course.
The thing that we could do is move the games. Okay, that's the thing. So there's enough pressure to move the games. They put off the Tokyo Games for a year for a pandemic. Why couldn't you put off these games for a year for a genocide? If a pandemic is a good reason to move the games, then a genocide is an even better reason. So that's the thing we should do. Is that's not going to happen because it's up to the IOC, and they're compromised and corrupted. But if they weren't compromised and corrupted, that's what they would do. They would move the games. Okay, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you for being here. I really enjoyed the book. My name is Roy Eakin, and I'm a graduate student at the Bush School of Government and Public Service at Texas A&M, and I'm also the co-president of AHS branch there. And I have a question about U.S.-Taiwan relations.
Mm-hmm.
So in your book, you discussed how there were many people in the Trump administration who were supportive of Taiwan and how there were advances involving arms sales and whatnot, but Trump himself was not personally supportive of Taiwan to a great degree. And so considering how there are many perspectives of how to address Taiwan, like some people will say that we should just recognize them as a sovereign state. Some will say we need to increase joint military drills. Some people say we shouldn't really do anything because it might endanger ties with China. And so I was just wondering what your perspective is regarding the future of U.S.-Taiwan relations and how the U.S. can substantively support Taiwan's sovereignty in the modern era.
Good question. So in the book, there's a lot of crazy Taiwan stories. There was the one that I just told you about how Trump took the call from Taiwanese President Tsai Ing-wen accidentally, and it really pissed him off, and he soured him on Taiwan. There's another one about how Deputy Assistant Secretary of State Alex Wong goes to Taiwan, makes a speech, just basic stuff like we're proud to be partners of Taiwan, and et cetera. And the Chinese government complained, and they go out to Trump in the White House and like, Mr. President, the Chinese government is complaining about Alex Wong's speech in Taiwan, and Trump's response is, quote, "Who the fuck is Alex Wong? And why is he in Taiwan? Get him out of there." You know what I mean? That was how sensitive he was to it. And then I have another story where a GOP senator during the Hong Kong protests much later in 2019, he goes to the president, he tries to sort of, appeal to his ego, which is like what a lot of people did with Trump, is like, don't do the right thing for the right reason. Do the right thing because this will help you in some sort of way. And so he says to him, if you don't stand up for Hong Kong, the next thing they're going to invade Taiwan. That's going to look really bad for you. You're going to be the president who lost Taiwan. And Trump says, quote, we're 8,000 miles away. The China's 2 feet away from Taiwan. If they invade, there isn't an effing thing we can do about it, except he didn't say effing, but try to be sensitive. Gabe told me not to curse that much. And, you know,
I said, to be clear, I said only you can't curse if it's gratuitous. If it's important, then I'm okay.
But if Trump is cursing gratuitously, and and anyway, it's neither here nor there. The point is, Trump didn't care about Taiwan, and nobody knew how much he didn't care about it. And if the Chinese had invaded in 2019, we wouldn't have come to their aid. Now, would we come to their aid in 2021? Strategic ambiguity. We don't know. Maybe we would, maybe we wouldn't. But at least that strategic ambiguity is meant to exert some sort of deterrence. And you know, what I see inside the administration is, again, two camps. Inside Biden world, I'm here to tell you, this is reporting. All right, I'm not making this up. You know, those people who think that the Chinese position, the CCP's position towards Taiwan has fundamentally changed. In other words, that this pattern of increasing aggression and interference that we've been seeing building for all of these years. Last time I was in Taiwan was 2019. It was everywhere. You know, they were picking losers and winners in local elections, exerting coercion on different parts of the economy to advance their aims. They bought up 80% of the media. This was before the corona, before Hong Kong. 80% of the media is CCP controlled or friendly, at least. And so there's some people inside the Biden administration say this trend is going to get worse and worse and worse. Therefore, we need to think about that. And then we need to respond. In other words, if we want to maintain the status quo, we have to realize that the Chinese are upsetting the status quo. And it's not being maintained by doing nothing. Doing nothing doesn't maintain the status quo. I'm in that camp. I agree with it. There's another camp that says, no. Yes, they're doing some, aggressive stuff, but, it doesn't mean we have to fundamentally rethink the way that we deal with Taiwan in the context of U.S.-China relations. And I disagree with that camp. I think those people are naive, frankly, and are failing to understand the reality of the CCP under Xi Jinping in 2021 that we're all forced to deal with, whether we like it or not. And as far as upsetting U.S.-China relations, I think that, this is like, again, a sort of a trope that, what do you mean we can't confront the CCP's bad behavior because they might be upset that we confront their bad behavior? In other words, the whole mission of the propaganda machine of the CCP is to convince us that confronting their bad behavior would upset them. And then we can't upset them, right? So we can't confront them. So we just have to do nothing, right? And this is like fueled by, again, those parts of our political system who want to do nothing anyway for their own policy reasons or for their own corrupt interests, because they're making money, like the Wall Street firm. So once we start, and I call it the smooth relations trap. Like, don't you want smooth relations? Isn't it great to have smooth relations? Yeah, I love smooth relations. I'd love that, but not at the expense of, sacrificing our national security, prosperity, and our public health, right? If smooth relations means we can't figure out what happened in the pandemic, then no, I think it's more important to find out what happened in the pandemic. If smooth relations means, ignoring a genocide, then no, I think, you know what I mean? So I think we're going to have to risk offending the delicate sensibilities of the CCP in order to object to a genocide that's happening on our watch. If we believe any of the stuff that we claim to believe, if we believe in human rights and the rule of law and the basic theory of the Enlightenment, the basic idea of America, the basic argument that individuals are born with rights, that these rights that they're not chattel of the party state, that they're not that people have that our creator or whatever, wherever you think we came from, that we're born with these rights. They're not granted to us by a king or a general secretary or even a president. And if you believe that, and I believe that, then actually having smooth relations with a genocidal regime is not the most important thing. That doesn't mean that we should seek bad relations. It means that we have to realize that relations are going to be tense for the long haul. Again, unless they want to, stop doing all this horrible stuff. And we have to accept that, we don't have to have terrible relations, but we don't have to have great relations. And that's the reality of the situation. So, I just don't come at me with this, are we going to, upset the delicate sensibilities of the CCP? Because it's a slippery slope. That's why, the NBA got, fined $400 million for a tweet. Well, one tweet upset the delicate sensibilities of the CCP. We got to punish the whole industry. Is that the world you want to live in? Is that, in essence, is that the compromise you're willing to make for smooth relations? It's not one that I'm willing to make.
I'm waiting for that Daryl Morey tweet to become a non-fungible token.
That's a great idea. Hold on, I gotta. Okay, well, I'll do it after the Zoom.
Elliot Seckler, the microphone is yours.
What's a non-fungible? Don't forget it. I know what it is. I still don't understand it.
Thanks for speaking with us today. I'm the AHS president at SAIS, currently entering my second year.
Nice.
So one of the central themes in the book tracks the CCP's influence operations within the US and its society. One manifestation of this is in conflicts of interest between politics and business. The vignette about the Chow family is but one example. You mentioned one quote in the book that, quote, "We're only as strong as our weakest link," close quote. So is the conflation of political business conflicts of interest America's weakest link in addressing China in the long term?
Yeah, it's one of them. I mean, that quote in the book refers to a story about our Montana Senator Steve Daines, who, in his effort to secure smooth relations, good relations, and to have the Chinese government rubber stamp some beef exports, which they did, counter-programmed against the Tibet hearing in Congress and invited or hosted a CCP delegation in the Capitol on the same day of a hearing on Tibet atrocities. And then that meeting became fodder for just tons of English language CCP propaganda, claiming that two US senators had said that like Chinese Communist Party rule of Tibet was wonderful and they were ecologically and culturally better off than they were before this, all this like horrendous stuff, and the quote was meant to say that like if you have a senator who's willing to do the CCP's political bidding in exchange for a little bit of beef sales or a lot of beef sales even, well, yeah, that convinces that the Chinese Communist Party that it might as well expand that strategy nationwide, which is exactly what they've done. And we're talking about mayors and governors and city councilmen and police associations. Why are police associations being funded by United Front cutouts, right? The influence is done through proxies organized by the United Front system at the core of the CCP's infrastructure, but operated through front organizations and billionaires from lots of different countries who launder the money hand over fist all day long for years and years and years into our institutions to corrupt our elites on both sides of the aisle. There's a Neil Bush story and there's a Hunter Biden story, right? It doesn't matter who's in power. They're trying to get both of them, right? That with as much cash as possible, as much as they'll take or whatever else they'll take, diamonds, women, you name it. Now, at schools like SAIS, that's a tough problem because part of what the United Front does is it sort of places Americans in a situation where they have competing values to choose from. We want openness, we want collaboration, we want Chinese students. We need to have human interactions with Chinese people and engagement. It's crucial to making sure that we don't fall into these silos where our societies can't deal with each other. It's really important. At the same time, if they're weaponizing that engagement against us, and if they're using that money to silence both Americans and also Chinese students on campus, well, that's a huge problem. And there are dozens of examples of that. I'm not talking about SAIS in particular, but dozens of examples of where that's the case. And so that's a tough thing. That's a conundrum, right? That's a conundrum of the US-China relations. Is how do we excise malign Chinese influence without cutting off our connections to Chinese people who are not the same as the Chinese party? One way is we separate the party from the people in the way that we think about it. Another way is that we stand up for basic values like transparency and accountability and free speech. If you're in America, you get free speech. It doesn't matter if you're Chinese or if you're the Dalai Lama or whoever it is. If you're on our soil, you can say what you want. I think that's a pretty basic rule, right? Does that apply? Can a Chinese student at SAIS say what they want to say? At University of Maryland, what happened, that it didn't turn out well when the Chinese student did that. And these are real tough problems. These are not easy things to solve. And I'm not here to offer you perfect solutions right at this moment. I'm just here to say that and all the sectors of our society are dealing with this. And I see these debates inside Wall Street and inside the tech community and inside our campuses. And a lot of the problem was that all those debates were siloed. These people weren't talking to each other. And when the national security community, when the FBI comes and knocking on your door and they're like, hey, we need to look at your China research, it doesn't always go well, right? And they mistakes were made. And so that's part of what the book is meant to do, is to start to fuel what's becoming a more robust national conversation about how do we deal with the shared problem. And, I just think that, for those people who say, well, there is no problem, well, okay, then I have a fundamental disagreement with you. And if you say there is no problem and you're also making a ton of money off of saying there is no problem, then I have a real problem with you.
So time is running short, and I pledged to end on time. So Josh, let me maybe end with this last question for you. Has your book been translated into Mandarin? And regardless of whether it's translated or not, what kind of reaction have you gotten to the book, either from the Chinese government itself, from the party, and for whatever interactions you might have via in this virtual world from Chinese people?
Right. Good question. So I'm pleased to announce for the first time on your webinar right now that the book, I have signed a contract to have the book translated into Chinese in Taiwan. So it will be translated and distributed in Taiwan, and that will be the first foreign translation. And we're hoping to get it translated into as many languages as possible. The Chinese Communist Party's reaction to my book has been to drastically increase the endless stream of trolls and bots and idiots and propagandists and shills who are filling all of my social media feeds on a constant basis. If you go there right now, you'll find a bunch of, okay. And it's a mix. Some of the bots can be ignored. Some of them are like, I've had Global Times articles written about me. It's like, okay, I guess I got their attention on that one. Most of that is about the Wuhan labs. There's nothing that they want more than to attack anyone who wants to look into these labs. But guess what? We're going to have to look into the labs, and that's not going to be easy, but that's definitely going to be something that they don't like, and so that's been the Chinese Communist Party reaction. It's not just me. They're sort of like ramping up their real harassment of anyone. And then they have like cutouts, and I think there are some in the American business community who have carried a lot of water for that kind of idea that any reasoned discussion of confronting Chinese Communist Party bad behavior is some sort of Cold War, Thucydides trap hawkishness, or whatever, but I'm here to tell you that's not the case. I don't want a Cold War any more than anyone else. I just want us to have an honest conversation about this problem. And I also would like to, defend the things that I believe in, and, which include, again, human rights and human dignity and individual liberty and, free speech and, the ideas of the Enlightenment that should guide us all, regardless of what system we're living in, towards treating each other with a dose of respect and humanity. And I don't expect the Chinese Communist Party to agree with that. And I don't expect them to stop being angry about it, but that's not going to stop me from continuing to advocate for that.
Josh Rogin, thanks for being here. Please, everybody, go buy the book, Chaos Under Heaven, available on Amazon. And I guess hopefully the borders open back up. And for those who want to go to Taiwan, you can read it there and order it there. You can find Josh in his Washington Post column on CNN, and hopefully in the future in this space at AHS. So thank you, everybody, for joining. Hope to see you at our next book talk with Neil Ferguson on Doom. Like I said, if Chaos wasn't exciting enough for you, maybe Doom will be. And if not, go to alexanderhamiltonsociety.org for everything that we do. So thank you, Josh.
Thank you, Gabe.
Have a great one.